welcome to Women Want In, the remarkable history of women running for public office in the 2020 election. We are here with Dr. Barbra Palmer from Baldwin Wallace University, and she is going to present for us. So Dr. Palmer, please take it away.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be able to talk about this. I know we're living in the era of COVID and podcasting, but any excuse to talk about this topic and I'm in. So thanks for listening. So I thought it'd be kind of fun to start out with a little quiz and just to sort of introduce you to some famous firsts. And I hope you find at least one of these stories like incredibly inspiring. But I thought this would be kind of a fun way to make this interactive, even though it is, you could watch this as a podcast, you can just listen, or you can actually watch on your screen. So my first question is, who was the first woman to run for any national office?
Ooh.
Was it Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, Jeanette Rankin, Claire Booth Luce, Shirley Chisholm, or Geraldine Ferraro?
So see, I want to pick the names I know. I want to pick the names I know, but it's probably going to be someone I've never heard of because that's just the way it usually is.
Actually, it's not. It's just in this case, it's the opposite, but it's going to be a surprise because it's Elizabeth Cady Stanton.
Oh, see, that's who we'd have gone with. Oh,
yeah, who knew? Because everybody's heard of Elizabeth Cady Stanton, right? She was the very first woman to run for U.S. House in 1866. And I never knew this about her. I mean, I was women's studies when I was working on my graduate degree, and we never learned about this. Everybody knows about her work with Susan B. Anthony and her fight for women's suffrage. But nobody knows that she ran for Congress in 1866. And she ran as an independent in New York, in her home state. And she was on the ballot and she got 24 votes. And she joked that was all of her brothers and nephews and her sons who showed up and voted for her.
All the people who didn't, were going to be at the dinner table and they didn't want to.
Exactly. But she did it as part of the campaign to win women the right to vote. She wanted to put there, because there were no laws that banned her from running for office. But there were laws that said she couldn't vote. And so she just wanted to show how completely absurd it was that she could run for office, but she couldn't even vote for herself. And so she was the very first one. She obviously didn't win, but she was on the ballot, and it was all about making a point, which I think is just awesome.
Absolutely.
So, what year did the first woman run for U.S. president? Was it 1872, 1920, 1972, 1984, or 2008?
Ooh, I'm gonna go early and say 1872. I feel like we were going for it as soon as we could.
Yeah, absolutely. That's correct. And in fact, the reason why I include this in here is because we can claim this woman as one of our own in Ohio. So the very first woman to ever run for president was a woman by the name of Victoria Woodhull, who was from Homer, Ohio. And she ran in 1872 for president. And her story is absolutely remarkable. She's just one of those people that even if, half the crazy stories about her are true, she's incredible. So she was the very first woman to open a bank on Wall Street with her sister. And she was a stockbroker. And she ran her own weekly newspaper. She was actively involved in women's rights and the suffrage movement. She knew Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, and she was actually the very first woman to ever testify before a congressional committee in Washington, D.C. And she spoke on women's suffrage, trying to convince Congress to add women's suffrage to the Constitution. So she was widely known as a public speaker on women's rights. She wasn't just famous, she was kind of infamous because she had some kind of radical views, particularly with regards to marriage. When she was growing up, she was emotionally abused by both of her parents. She was one of like 9 or 10 kids living in a house with all of her siblings and 12 more cousins. So there were just children everywhere. And so she had to drop out of school at a young age. And at the age of 14, she got married just so she could get out of the house. It was not a good match. The man she married was an alcoholic. And she eventually was able to get a divorce, which back in the day was like a really big deal. You had to go before the state legislature and have them grant you a divorce. So she was kind of infamous. But and so all around, she thought marriage was just legally and socially and psychologically a really bad deal for women. So she has this famous quote that's attributed to her where she says, well, at least prostitutes get paid.
She has a point.
Yes. So she decided to run for president when she was 33 years old. Now, this meant that she was constitutionally ineligible. You have to be 36, I believe, if you're going to run for president. And on election day, as far as we know, she wasn't actually on the ballot in any state. But she did run. She did have a campaign. And we have all kinds of really cool banners and stuff and posters of her. But on election day, she was actually in jail. So in her newspaper, she actually distributed her newspaper through the mail. That was how she reached most of the people she described. And back in the day, there was this old arcane kind of obscure law in New York that prohibited the sending of obscene material through the mail. And
I've heard of it.
Yeah, this law eventually became the model for the Comstock Act that was passed by Congress. And so she was prosecuted under that law. So what happened was she published a story. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm getting a ton of feedback. Is anybody else having that?
You're cutting a little bit in and out, but it's not too bad.
Okay, sorry about that.
That's okay.
So anyway, she's in jail because she had published a story in her newspaper where accusing the very famous preacher Ward Beecher, who is Harriet Beecher Stowe's brother. He was like one of these super famous preachers of the time. He kind of had what we would call a mega.
I went to Thomas K. Beecher Elementary, so I'm familiar with the Beechers. Yeah.
There you go. So super famous. And part of, the movers and shakers in New York City at the time. And so she published a story in her newspaper about him, which was all true, if a little bit embellished, about him having an affair with his best friend's wife.
Ooh.
And she got pregnant and it did not end well. So she called him out on his hypocrisy. And there was actually this legal war that began between Beecher and the woman's husband that the woman's husband sued Beecher, and this whole saga went on for years. And because Victoria Woodhull published the story, Beecher was able to influence the powers that be in New York and have her arrested and thrown in New York City's notorious prison, where she spent a couple of months. So, her story is just amazing. There's this great biography about her called Other Powers by Barbara Goldsmith that I highly recommend. Don't be intimidated by the length. It's like 600 pages. I read it in 3 days because I couldn't stop reading it. It was just so interesting. So we should be very proud here in Ohio that we can claim Victoria Woodhull as one of our own.
Yes, absolutely.
All right. So who was the first woman ever elected to a national office? We've already talked about Elizabeth Cady Stanton, so you can rule her out. Jeanette Rankin, Claire Booth Luce, Shirley Chisholm, or Pat Schroeder?
I don't know, but I'm going to go with C.
Okay. Claire Booth Luce is a very famous person, a woman who was elected to Congress, but it was actually Jeanette Rankin, who was first elected to U.S. House in 1916 from the state of Montana. She's another amazing person. She worked really hard to get women in Montana the right to vote. So there were a lot of states prior to the passage of the 19th Amendment in 1920 that had, especially out west, that had provisions of giving women suffrage. And Jeanette Rankin lobbied the Montana legislature really hard to make that happen in Montana in 1914. And so she was really well known in the state. And her brother said, hey, you should run for Congress. So she did, and she won. So she gets sworn in, and there's a standing ovation in the House, and her colleagues were actually very welcoming to her. And later that day, she had to vote on whether or not the United States should enter World War I. One of the issues that she fought really hard for through her whole life was keeping the United States out of foreign wars. She was a pacifist in her heart. Like, that was the one issue, in addition to women's rights, that she really cared about. So in 1917, she, along with about 50 other members of Congress, actually voted no on getting the United States involved in World War I. That was a very unpopular position. And so that made it really difficult. I'm sorry, I'm getting a ton of feedback again. I don't know how.
Oh, I'm sorry.
What's happening. I'm on cords, so I'm not sure that, I don't think this is me. So we'll just wait and hopefully it quiets down. All right, we good?
Yep.
Okay. So her vote on keeping the United States out of World War I was very unpopular. So she was not successful in seeking re-election in 1918. But that's not the end of her story. She decides to run again in 1940, and she wins.
Oh, yay!
Yeah, and a couple months after she's sworn in,
oh no, I see where this is going.
Yeah, she has to vote on whether or not the United States should enter World War II.
Yeah.
This time, she's the only no vote in the entire Congress, the only no vote in the House, and of course, all of the senators voted yes. And so she voted no, stuck, true to her pacifist principles. But then in 1942, she's like, I'm not even going to bother running. But that's not the end. She actually, in her 70s and 80s, traveled to Washington, D.C. to lead protests against the Vietnam War.
I was about to say, please tell me she didn't run right before the Vietnam War, because
well, she thought about it. She was in the process of getting her name on the ballot, I think in 1972, and unfortunately she passed away. But I just love her story, and she's just one of those women that just got a ton accomplished and was a real trailblazer, not just in women's rights, but in all kinds of other issues as well. So Jeanette Rankin is a name that you need to know about. All right, so who was the first woman elected to the U.S. House to represent Ohio? Was it Marcy Kaptur, Florence Allen, Joanne Davidson, Frances Payne Bolton, or Stephanie Tubbs Jones? Now, these are all women who are famous in Ohio politics, but one of them was the first woman from Ohio to go to Washington, D.C.
See, now I kind of regret guessing because I'm just showing how little I know.
Well, that's kind of the point. That's why I picked these questions. If you knew it, you wouldn't have to listen to this talk, right?
That's very true. I'm going to go with B.
Okay, you're close. So Florence Allen is a huge name in Ohio politics. Florence Allen was the first woman first woman to ever be elected to the Cuyahoga County Court of Common Pleas. And she was the first woman elected to the Ohio State Supreme Court in 1922, which made her the first woman ever elected to any state Supreme Court in the entire country. So, and she was the very first woman to ever serve on the Federal Court of Appeals. So she has this incredible trailblazing career in the judicial branch. But the first woman to represent Ohio in Congress was Frances Payne Bolton, who is a big name in Northeast Ohio. And so she came from a very wealthy family. And in fact, she was at one point one of the wealthiest women in the entire country.
Wow.
Back in the 30s and 40s. So during World War I, she inherited a trust fund that was created by her uncle, who happened to be one of the creators of Standard Oil. So she inherited all that money. But her family had this real dedication to public service. Her grandfather had served in the Ohio State Senate and actually ran for president a couple times. And her husband, Chester Bolton, served in the Ohio Senate and in the U.S. House. And she was very actively involved in all of his campaigns. Well, in October of 1939, Chester, her husband, died while he was serving in the U.S. House. And so she was approached and asked to run in the special election to fill his seat. And she won. And because she knew, she had run his campaign, she had run his office in D.C., so she knew exactly what she was doing.
She was the best person for the job.
Yeah. And so party leaders, she joked that, the party leaders just said, hey, will you fill his seat till we find a real man to fill the seat? And she was like, sure, wink, wink.
Yeah.
With her, what's fascinating about her is one of the things that she really dedicated her life to was the education and support of nurses, particularly nurses who served in the military. So with a whole big pile of her money, she actually gave it to what was at the time Western Reserve University to create a nursing school, which is now called the Case Western Reserve Francis Payne Bolton School of Nursing. And so
Mhm.
supporting nurses was like her issue. And so she's actually served for 15 terms in the US House, making her one of the longest serving women ever. And she served until the age of 83, which is pretty remarkable. And her son, Oliver, also ran for Congress. And so she's the only woman who has ever served at the same time as her son. So her whole family was really, really dedicated to public service. Now, there is one other woman on that list of multiple choice answers that we need to talk about, and that's Marcy Kaptur. So Marcy Kaptur is currently serving in the U.S. House from Ohio, representing Ohio's 9th District. And she's what we call the dean of the women in the House, which means that she holds the distinction of currently being the longest serving woman in the House. Now, as it turns out, she also just broke the record for the longest serving woman ever in the history of the House. She was first
Wow.
elected in 1982. And it's a great story. She was actually working on her PhD at MIT. And she had been very active in local Toledo politics, and party leaders approached her and asked her to run. And it was kind of a long shot. The Democrats weren't supposed to win because she was taking on a Republican incumbent. And she agreed to run and then had to figure out, well, how am I going to raise money? And so she had a bake sale, and people kind of laughed at her. But this was back in 1982. They raised $10,000 just selling baked goods.
Mhm.
And that money was like a big part of her success. So, bake sales have always been a big part of her campaigns. So
Mhm.
in 2020, she was elected to her 20th term. So she's a
Wow.
mover and shaker in the US House on behalf of
Mhm.
the 9th District of Ohio. Okay, one last question. What year was the first woman of color elected to national office? 1954, 64, 68, 72, or 89? And those are all important dates, but the first woman of color was elected in one of these years.
I don't know. 1972 is jumping out at me, so I'm going to go with that one.
Okay, well, we're going to talk about 1972. That's an important year. But the good news is it was actually a little earlier. It was 1964. Patsy Mink was a Democrat from Hawaii. And so
Mhm.
she ran in 1964 and won a US House seat. And she is just in a really interesting career and is a fascinating person. And I don't know, there's something in the water in Hawaii, but they send a lot of women to Congress. And so Patsy Mink just started a very long
Mhm.
tradition. And she actually ran for president in 1972. So
Oh.
what I love about this is she was only on the ballot in the state of Oregon for the Democratic primary. And it was actually the people in Portland, Oregon, who convinced her to get her name on the ballot and helped her out in that state, because back in the day, there were no direct flights from Hawaii to Washington, D.C.
Uh,
So she always had a stopover. At the time, her stopover was in Portland, Oregon. So
mhm.
she actually had an apartment in Portland, and the people kind of adopted her as their honorary member of Congress, and they just loved her. So they convinced her to get on the ballot in Oregon in the
Mhm.
1972 election for president. So she's the first woman of color to serve. But I also want to mention the first Black woman to serve, and that's Shirley Chisholm. So she was elected to the U.S. House in 1968 from New York, and also just an amazing person, just incredibly tenacious. And so she ran for president in 1972 as well, and she was on the ballot in 12 states and won 152 delegates to the Democratic National Convention. Um,
Wow.
and her story was documented in this fantastic documentary called Unbought and Unbossed, which I believe is available in Amazon Prime. Totally
Mhm.
worth watching. They have all this fantastic footage of her from her 72 campaign and all of the challenges that she faced from inside her own party and the people who, were doing everything they possibly can to keep her out of the process. And it's just a fantastic story. And she's just, a really, really inspirational person as well. So now that you've had all this great inspiration, I'm a social scientist, so I like digging around in data. And so I'm going to try to give you the big picture now, and we'll look at some historical trends and see if we can sort of figure out any kinds of patterns that are happening.
Mhm.
So this is, I'm wondering if we can, if this is recording, like right now, the video little mini things are blocking part of this. And so I wonder if that matters, or if I can move. No, that's not going to work. Well, anyway, what I love about this diagram is it goes all the way back to 1917. So that little 1 down in the lower left-hand corner, that's Jeanette Rankin.
Mhm.
And it takes you all the way up to the 2014 election. And you can't see the last couple of years, but that's okay, because we're going to talk more about those in a minute. So as you can see, we don't really see major increases in the number of women in Congress really until the 1970s. And
Mhm.
in fact, we see increases in the 50s and then declines in the 60s. And then sort of this kind of slow, steady progression. And then we hit that spike from 30 to 48 in 1992. We're going to talk a lot more about that. But I want to explain, there's one little quirk in this diagram, and that is there are 435 members of the US House, but this is actually out of 441. So this includes the 6 delegates from the US territories like Puerto Rico. Because it turns out there's actually a lot of women among those delegates.
Mhm.
Over history. So those have been included in this, but it doesn't change the overall shape of that trend.
Mhm.
And so that's why I like this. And you can see that, prior to the 70s, there were pretty much roughly equal numbers of Democratic and Republican women in Congress. And you don't
Mhm.
start to see these huge gaps between the parties until really the 1990s. So here's the thing. If you stare at that graph long enough and you look at the numbers, the average net increase in the number of women in the US House every 2 years. So every time we have a House election, how many additional women do we get? It's 3. So if you that's the average. So
Mhm.
if you do the math, that means the US House will reach gender parity by the year 2102.
Yeah, it seemed like kind of a slow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's kind of discouraging. On the other hand, there have been some interesting things that have happened very recently. So history is really helpful in helping us understand, the trends and the barriers, but a lot
Mhm.
can change in just a single election cycle. So that's what I want to spend the rest of my time talking about. This idea that sometimes we see occasional surges in the number of women running and winning. So every once in a while, we'll see a spike in the number of women who are out there running in primaries for US House and for other offices too, and then winning, and then the primaries, and then winning the general. So 1992 is was the first example of this. And so the exuberant press saw all these women running, and they dubbed it the year of the woman. And so 1992 is interesting because it was kind of like the perfect storm for female candidates. Um, there were all kinds of open seats, which is very rare. So typically, when you have 435 House members running every 2 years, in a typical election cycle, you'll have around 35, 25 to 35 open seats out of
Mhm.
435. So that means you've got, 410 incumbents who are running, and incumbents almost always win. So you don't have a whole lot of opportunity for new people. Well, in
Mhm.
1992, there were 95 open seats,
Wow.
which is a record in the modern era. And so incumbents at the time had several incentives to retire. First, you had a major financial scandal involving the House Bank, where a lot of members got caught writing hundreds of bad checks. And then 1992 was also the first election after a redistricting cycle. So a lot of
Mhm.
incumbents were in districts that had been substantially redrawn, and they were forced, and suddenly they had a new constituency in a district that they didn't know. So rather than
Mhm.
run again, it's like, I'm out. Also,
Mhm.
1992 was the last year that you could cash out your campaign account and transfer it into your own personal bank account and like head to Bermuda. So
Ooh.
since 1992, that is illegal. If you have money left in your campaign account and you decide
Mhm.
to retire, you can't just cash out. Most candidates now will give it to other candidates, or you can give it back to the people who gave it to you. I think you can also give it to charity. So you can't just like make yourself rich with that, extra 2
Mhm.
million bucks that you got sitting in your campaign account. So 1992 is the last year you can do that. So a lot of incumbents were like, bye-bye.
Yeah.
Um, so we also had so we had this super high number of open seats. But women
Mhm.
were also highly motivated to run in 1992.
Mhm.
It was sort of the perfect issue constellation for women. So education was like the number one issue on people's minds. And, women are perceived as being, better on education issues than men. And this is, you have to remember, this is right after the Anita Hill, Clarence Thomas hearings. So in 1991, the nation is watching, these hearings where Clarence Thomas has been nominated to this U.S. Supreme Court to fill Justice Marshall's seat after he passed away. And women across the nation are livid by the way that Anita Hill is being treated by the all-white male Senate Judiciary Committee, which incidentally was chaired by Joe Biden. Um, and so you got to remember, this is back in 1992. People weren't terribly woke. And so women were pissed, and
Mhm.
that motivated a lot of women to run in 1992. So we saw these dramatic increases. So we went from, so the number of women in the House almost doubles. And these numbers are
Mhm.
small today, but I mean, if you look at that in terms of, of a percentage increase, it's huge.
It's
And
huge. Yeah.
yeah, and we like to joke that, hey, the number of women in the Senate tripled. And yeah, it
Mhm.
went from 2 to 6, but still, I mean, that's a
That,
noticeable increase.
that's how these things start, though, is
Yeah.
often, that kind of energy that,
Yep.
comes off of that.
Yeah, exactly. And so 92 was the first one of these sort of year of the woman. And we've had a couple mini years of the woman, like 2006 was another good year for women, but not like the last 2 election cycles. 2018 was another huge year of the woman, like to the likes of which we've never seen before. And then 2018 smashed all kinds of records, and then 2020 smashed those records.
Mhm.
So we've had 2 huge years for women in a row. So I've given you some data here that you can kind of stare at for a while. And so I've given you 2014 to 2020. And the reason I did this is I want you to be able to see, so the change from 2014 to 2016 is kind of typical. And
Mhm.
so the number of women running in primaries nationwide in US House races, it increases from 253 to 273, which is an increase of 20. And that's pretty typical in a 2-year cycle to see that kind of change. And then in terms
Mhm.
of winning, again, you see a slight increase in the number of women winning primaries. Now, unfortunately, in that year, from between 2014 and 2016, the number of women who won the general election for US House actually declined by 1. And
Mhm.
again, when we're talking about net changes of 2 or 3 a year, you're going to get years where you actually backslide a little bit. So
Mhm.
I wanted to put those 2 years in so you can see sort of what like a typical change looks like.
Mhm.
Then look at the change from 2016 to 2018. You have almost double the number of women running in primaries, significant increases in the women winning primaries, and a net
Mhm.
increase of almost 20 among women who won the general election. So we go from an average of 3 compared to an increase of 20, which is just incredible. And then it
Mhm.
happens again in 2020. We see a huge increase, almost 100 in women running in primaries. We see a big jump in the number of women winning. And again, we see a huge surge in the number of women who actually win the general election. So in just
Mhm.
2 election cycles, we've seen this huge change. And so the interesting thing is, well, is this the new normal? And so will we get to parity a lot quicker? And I think that's a really, really interesting question. And so, 2018 was another sort of perfect storm that was crazy similar to 1992, because again, you had an issue environment that really motivated women to run, and you had an unusually high number of open seats. So in 2018, there were 60 open seats. And a lot of those were created by men who were involved in sexual harassment scandals, who had stepped down. And so this is the era of Me Too. Plus, you have thousands of women who are motivated by the Women's March the day after the presidential inauguration in 2016, who are getting involved in politics because of a lot of the sexist remarks that Trump made during the campaign. So in 2018, we have another example of a large number of open seats and women being really motivated. And so we see this spike, and that continues into the 2020 election as well. So what I'm going to do now is I'd like to talk a little bit about Ohio. And what's frustrating is we didn't see a lot of these surges. We really haven't had years of the woman in Ohio for a whole host of reasons. So we've seen no significant increases in the state legislature in these years. We've still never had a woman run under a major party label for governor in Ohio. We've never elected a woman to the US Senate. And the one that I think is the most fascinating is Ohio sends 16 people to the US House. We have 16 House districts in Ohio. Only 3 of those are women, but it has remained 3 for 10 years. So in other words, there has been no increase in the number of women that Ohio is sending to the US House in 10 years. And in fact, it's been the same 3 women for those 10 years. It's the only women who seem to be able to win a US House race in Ohio are female incumbents. And what's fascinating though, is if you look a little bit broader, in 2018 and in 2020, there were women running in US House primaries in almost every single of those 16 districts, but they couldn't win the general. And I would argue that this is partially because, Ohio is just so gerrymandered that there are no close races in Ohio anymore for US House. Every district, the outcome is predetermined. It doesn't matter who's running. As long as you have the right party label after your name, you're going to win. And so as a result, I think Ohio is actually falling behind the rest of the nation when it comes to representation of women in its legislative delegations. So I think there's some really interesting things happening in Ohio that, because we're just not following the national trends like we used to, especially when it comes to women's representation. So anyway, so that's, my thing. And I'd love to entertain questions or anything else you want to talk about.
Well, it's interesting that, that you end with it, because as we said, I'm not from Ohio, I'm from New York. But one of the things that I've heard, since moving here, when it comes to elections, that it has been said until recently, as Ohio goes, so goes the nation when it comes to elections. And yet we seem to kind of have gone backwards now, where we're entrenched in something while everybody else is moving past us. And I don't know. Go ahead.
Well, when I first moved to Ohio 10 years ago, I was super excited because I was finally moving to a swing state where my vote actually mattered. And as someone who studies elections, I'm like, wow, this is so exciting, because I lived in Minnesota, which is deep, deep blue. I lived in Texas, which at the time was deep, deep red. And then I lived in DC, which was deep, deep blue. And I'm sorry, but boring. And so when I moved to Ohio, a purple state, I was like, woohoo, this is going to actually be fun. But what's happened, I think, especially in the last 5 years, is, most people would agree that Ohio no longer is the bellwether that it used to be. And it's because of the demographic changes that are happening in Ohio and the rest of the country. Ohio's population is getting much older. We're actually losing population while states like Texas are growing. And compared to the rest of the nation, our population is also getting whiter. And so, it's not true anymore that so goes Ohio, so goes the nation, because we are no longer a microcosm of the rest of the country. And you can really see that in 2016 and in 2020. And that has ramifications for the election of women as well. These demographic changes and redistricting and gerrymandering are all related to this issue of the representation of women.
So what do you think, if I wanted to say, okay, well, I, as a woman, as a voter, as a citizen, I'm interested in changing, how Ohio reacts to these elections, how, the gerrymandering, what would you suggest I learn, study, focus on if I wanted to change how Ohio was moving forward in these respects?
Well, yeah, and we're at a kind of really critical time, I think, because obviously we've just did the latest census, and there's been a lot of controversy and a lot of issues trying to do a census during the age of COVID. And we're about to enter the next period of redistricting where, Ohio's going to find out, are we going to hold on to all 16 of our House seats, or are we going to lose one? And that's going to dramatically affect how those lines are drawn. Now, voters in Ohio approved some reforms through referenda or through initiative to this redistricting process. So we're about to embark on this really interesting experiment where Ohio's U.S. House district lines are going to be drawn using a method that no other state has tried before, that requires some of the minority party to buy into the new maps that are going to be drawn. And so I think what I would encourage anybody to do is learn all you can about this redistricting process and this new process. And there's all kinds of information out there from the League of Women Voters and Common Cause and other organizations that are trying to get the word out, because the way we draw these maps is going to be incredibly important. And if nothing else, just educating yourself on the process so you can understand what's happening, and then contacting your state legislators to tell them what you think about this.
And if I were someone, say a librarian who was, just one of the common folk who was interested in getting involved in my local politics and becoming one of these women who are trying to move forward and matter, what would you recommend that we do? What's the best way in on our level?
Oh my gosh, just run. It's, as someone who digs through a lot of election data, I am stunned at the number of races in Ohio where people are running uncontested. One party puts up a candidate and the other party doesn't even bother putting up a candidate. And, there have been cases that I've seen for state legislature where a write-in candidate wins with 50 votes and they are the party nominee. And because the opposing party didn't put up a candidate, they become a state legislator.
That's how you see these stories in the news where the Mr. Softy mascot is now the mayor of so-and-so Ohio because he was the only guy running, right?
Exactly. One of my favorite stories is of this town, I think it was in Virginia, that nobody was willing to be the town commissioner. I can't remember what it was like. It was basically the equivalent of the mayor, but they called it something else. And the old mayor had been doing it for 30 years and he was tired and he wanted to retire, but nobody would do it. So he put his dog's name on the ballot and the dog won. So that's not how democracy is supposed to work. And I know we're all busy and I know we all have better things to do, but this stuff matters. I always tell my students that whether you're paying attention or not, government's going to hit you with a steamroller, whether you're looking at it or you're looking away. And so these things affect our daily lives, whether you're paying attention or not. So at least pay attention.
So if you're, go ahead.
No, and I was just going to say, and I know it's really hard because there's a lot of really bad and false and scary information out there, but there are ways that you can get really good, high quality news and educate yourself.
So basically, if you're interested, don't wait for greatness to find you. You go out there and just, don't think, well, I'm just, I'm, who am I to be running for this seat? I don't know anything. You're a person, you're a voter, you're a citizen. Don't wait for, for some, golden halo to descend on high and find you, just get in there, and figure it out along the way, because it is our government, it is our democracy, and that is our responsibility, and more becoming a woman's democracy as much as a man's. And So don't wait. Just if you're interested, if you're passionate, just give it a go and see what happens.
Yep. Ann Richards, who was a former governor of Texas back in the 90s, had this great quote. And she said, the problem is people don't understand that the government isn't them, it's us.
Mm-hmm.
And I always say too, like, if you didn't vote, then you have no right to complain.
Mm-hmm. Yes,
Yeah.
that's very true.
Another quote that I love that has been attributed to Eleanor Roosevelt, sort of bringing us back to the issue of women running, is
Mm-hmm.
she said, we will have reached true equality when there are as many stupid women in government as there are stupid men.
That is fair, because there's definitely this. Well, if you think about it, I mean, I feel like often there's this idea that, in order to succeed and excel as a woman, you have to be amazing. You have to be someone who is above and beyond, whereas men are kind of starting at an advantage of it. Just being a man is enough to get their hat in the ring.
Right. Yeah.
So there is some truth to that, if,
Yes.
when we start to see that, it's is true for women as it is for men, that, oh, that's not exactly, not excited about that candidate, but, legitimate, then that would be a good thing.
Yeah. I mean, there's tons of research that shows this, that, men just wake up. And again, these are tendencies. Men just wake up and say, I think I'm going to run for president. And then they do. And meanwhile, women are like, oh, I don't think I'm qualified. I need to talk to my husband. I need to think about my kids. I need to talk to people. I don't know if I have the, even though I just raised $50,000 for my kids' school, I don't know how to fundraise. I mean, it's all of this second guessing. Meanwhile, there's already 10 guys who have jumped in the race. And that's a problem. And so, another really simple thing you can do is tell your female friends and your nieces and your daughters that they should run for office. It's something as simple as that.
Well, and to go all the way to the top, when you see someone like Vice President Harris elected, then, that is huge for little girls across the board, little girls of color. It's just to look at that and be like, there is no limit anymore.
Yeah, exactly.
Like, I just have to turn my heart and my mind to it, and I can go as far as, I can go. Absolutely. So that has been huge as well.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. My friends and I always say it's very hard to measure, but never underestimate the 9-year-old girl effect, of just being able, like you said, to see that it changes everything.
Well, and if you think, 50, 60 years ago, if you were to look at, politics on the TV, the wife, it was you saw the governor's wife, standing back there with her pearls and her smile. And, she was doing amazing things, they were, that they weren't getting any credit for,
right.
But that was the role. And now, you can turn the TV and see, like I said, Vice President Harris, up there, and so many other, great, strong women doing these amazing things. And it's not like that is now the role. And I think that is going to really change how, my children grow up in the government that they live in. So.
Absolutely.
So. Well, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate you coming here and giving this talk. And, I am excited to share it with our patrons and with our community. And again, thank you so much.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to turn off the recording. Hold on one moment.
Great.